Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 7 of xAPI. And we have a really interesting session. We're going to be talking about Unity, which is the game engine, and enhancing Unity games with xAPI with art from Risk. And before we get started, I just have a couple slides to go over. And I'll drop some links in chat. So we have Learning 2024. It's open for proposals. This is going to happen the first week in December in Orlando, Florida. So if you're from the cold climates, you might want to come down and join us in Orlando. And we have the call for proposals, and I'll drop the link in chat. And please consider making a proposal for this conference. We'd love to hear from new voices, old voices, and your perspectives. The next thing we have on the docket is we have an ebook about 10 ways you're getting gamification wrong. I bet you didn't know that, but after this ebook, you'll learn free member benefit, and I'll post that link in chat when I'm done speaking. And of course, this is a xAPI cohort, and it is produced by the Learning Guild. Some of you are members, some of you are not. And if you're not a member, I would highly encourage you to become a member, because this is just one of the things that we offer. We also offer research reports like that, absolutely free to you with your membership, and various other publications. We get discounts to the face-to-face conferences and the online conferences. We have a number of free webinars throughout the year, and it's just a great, and we have Learning Solutions magazine where you find a lot of information. So I'll drop that link in chat in just a minute. Now, as if you've been to cohort before, you know, towards the end of our time together, we do team updates. And if you are part of a team and you'd like to give an update, please private message me here in the platform while we're listening to Art present, because we are going to have a little bit at the end, and we'd love to hear where you are in week 7. We're more than halfway. So we only go to week 12. And we want to see where people are. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and turn things over to Art. So Art, when you're ready, please begin. All right, Art, we're seeing your screen, but we're not hearing you. So I'm not sure.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Okay, helps if I switch my mic on. So what I'm going to look at today is something that was actually customer driven, where we had during the pandemic a lot of customers asking how they could send xAPI statements to our learning record store and ultimately get credit in our LMS. Well, fortunately, we own the LMS and the LRS, so we were able to do that for them without their content knowing anything about the LMS itself. But the key role that needed to be played was something needed to send the statements, and they were using Unity, so we figured out how to do that for them. First of all, I want to give you an agenda of what we're going to do. First of all, we're going to look at some xAPI libraries for Unity. There are several to choose from. I've been through all the ones that I know about, and there is definitely one that's better than the others, and we'll look at that. Talk about the first game that I built, which was basically getting a game from Unity samples and adding xAPI to it. Then we'll talk about the library of choice, xAPI and Unity, and we'll look at that in depth and how you would actually add your statements into Unity using that library. And then finally, we'll come to some resources. Do have a couple of disclaimers. I'm not a Unity developer or employee, so I only know enough Unity to build this one complete game. I don't play with it all the time. And if you have Unity questions, I probably can't help you. If you have GBLxAPI questions, the library that we're going to use, I might be able to help you. Some part of these presentation is technical. There is no way to send xAPI statements from Unity without using C# code. which is a Microsoft development tool. Unity utilizes that for all of their expanded programming or advanced programming. So we're going to have to take a look at some technical code. There are open source libraries available for a lot of things to send xAPI. You can do it in JavaScript. There's one from ADL for JavaScript, Objective-C, Java, PHP, Python, and C#. The one we're going to take a look at, or the three we're going to take a look at, are for sending it from C# with Unity. Unfortunately, that is the background coding language for Unity itself. The first thing I did when this customer asked me, how can you send xAPI statements from Unity? Well, I needed a game to play. And this is a little roll the ball game where you roll the blue ball around, you hit the yellow pickups, which are actually spinning in the game, and it makes a little beeping sound. And once they're all picked up, you finish that level. Now I wanted to make it a little bit more advanced than the example, so I made a second level. And then finally, I wanted to have a leaderboard. So that's essentially three statements I needed to send. I needed to send that you completed the first level and what your duration was. I needed to send the second level and what your duration was. And then finally, I sent a completed statement that combines the two durations for the overall game itself. And that's how I'm going to get my leaderboard, is just to look at the final durations. There are three API libraries for Unity that will send xAPI statements. The one I'm most familiar with is tincan.net from Rusty Software. I've been using that for a really long time because we use it in our own LMS to send statements to our LRS. So I was very familiar with it. And that's what I started with first. Then I found from ADL that they have a wrapper that's available on the ADL GitHub site. And it's fairly easy to use, and will also send statements. None of these were really satisfying, so I was actually contacted by GBLxAPI, the people that support it, and asked if I would review their library since I did a review of the other two. And I found that the latest copy they had worked really well, so that's really the one I'm going to be looking at. I do want to tell you that at the end of this presentation, I have posted my working example that utilizes Unity and its C# backend and the GBLxAPI library to send three statements, and also has a leaderboard. So you don't need to write anything down looking at this. I'm not going to look line by line through the code because A, it would bore you to death, and B, we don't have enough time to do that. I'm just going to look at some of the highlights, and then you can download the free working source code yourself from GitHub and try it out in Unity and trace it through and see how it works. The first library I mentioned was tincan.net. I won't go through all the details, but it was actually very difficult to integrate it with Unity because it uses some different libraries that Unity doesn't like. Also, Unity does something called code stripping. Now, this was a couple of years ago, and I know they have newer versions that do much less code stripping. But what does that mean? It means if you have code in your program and Unity can't see where you're calling it and you're using a Microsoft library, Microsoft will delete that library when you build the program because it thinks you don't need it, and it's trying to make its games smaller, which is certainly an admirable goal. But it would be great if it didn't do that if you were calling the library. So I had a lot of difficult time getting Unity to not strip out libraries that I was using or that are used by tincan.net. The game would run fine in the developer environment, and then when I would build it, it just wouldn't send any statements. So it was very difficult to track down. The nice thing about the tincan.net is it addresses all of the API that are associated with xAPI. So you can send statements, you can fetch statements back, which is important for my need. You can also write to the agent API, agent profile API. You can write to the state and write a document that you can fetch later. So it's a very, very flexible library and addresses all elements of xAPI. But it was hard to implement in Unity. The second library I took a look at was the Unity wrapper that's provided free by ADL. It's a very simple integration. It does address the sending and fetching of statements, so you can send and receive. It does not address any other of the API, like the agent profile, the documents API, the state. and it doesn't have any of those code stripping issues. So in a way, it was a lot easier than the tincan.net library. The cons are it's extremely poorly documented. I really had to read through the code to figure out how it worked instead of just reading a document and following the instructions. It's much less object-oriented than tincan.net, which probably for most people's purposes is okay. In a development environment, it's fine to play with that. In a production environment, not so much. If you're a programmer, you tend not to want to use language that are not object-oriented. Also, it does not address all of the various properties of a statement. So it has kind of the basics, the active verb and object, but anything like an extension or a context activity is either not implemented or very hard to implement using this library. The other thing I didn't like about it is you might have some properties that you're not utilizing, say the duration, and that should be set, that you want to set to null. Well, the library goes ahead and sends it, even if you don't set a value for it, which it should not do. General rules in JSON, if you're not going to populate an object property, then don't send it because you're just bloating your JSON, and there's no reason to do it. So what I ended up with was the GBLxAPI library because it accomplished most of the things I wanted to do right out of the box. This library was developed under a National Science Foundation research grant. It is an open source library. It's available on GitHub, then you can download it for free. It is designed for K-12, but you can adapt it because you can add your own verbs and you can override the verbs and basically create your own vocabulary. The vocabulary that's there is very much K-12 oriented. As I mentioned earlier, I had written some articles on using the tincan library and the ADL library, and did not cover the GBLxAPI library. I was contacted by them and asked to do a code review of their latest version, and did make some small suggestions that they accepted. That's not why I'm biased for it. I'm biased for it because it was just a much more easier to use and complete library than the other two. So unfortunately, we have to look at code. As I mentioned earlier, this is a very technical thing to do, trying to add xAPI to Unity, and you have to use C#. The first thing I wanted to look at is this ability to create your own vocabulary. So if you look where it says data, this last folder that's open on the screen, you can see a bunch of JSON files and meta files associated with them. So there's a vocabulary default, which includes verbs, objects, activity types, all kinds of elements of the xAPI language. So you can use the ones that they have, or you can create this last file where the arrow is shown, and the next to last file that says vocab_user. And the way this works is anything that you put in the user file will override an existing verb in the default file. So I didn't want to use the particular completed verb that they had in their default library because I was kind of trying to write more towards a CMI5 element, and I'm familiar with that vocabulary. So I put in my own completed verb to match better what the library uses in CMI5. I also added a satisfied statement because I needed that to satisfy the overall game. So when GBLxAPI runs, it does this merging of the two files for you, your own custom vocabulary and the default, to end up with the vocabulary you're trying to utilize in your application. Configuration. First thing we have to do when we're going to start running GBLxAPI in our Unity project is we have to set some configuration properties. And this is done in a file called GBLconfig.cs, CS standing for C#. And there are some constants or some properties in there that you need to set. So you need to point to your LRS endpoint with the LRS URL property. The company URI property is actually used as the actor's home page if the account method of identifying an actor is used. So I did go ahead and populate that. And the game URI is the unique identifier of your game. So whenever you send statements, somewhere in them, you're going to identify the game that someone is playing, so you can do some reporting and show all the things that occurred in that particular game. Credentials. You have to tell the GBL system what your LRS user ID and what your password are, and these are set in the GBL interface.cs. I would have preferred that they be set in the config, but this is how GBLs is doing. I'd rather have it all in one place. Now, what this means is that your LRS user ID, your LRS user ID and your password are hard coded, as well as the properties we saw on the screen, because you're putting them right into the code. If you want to read them externally, you can certainly do that. It takes a little bit of C# code, because you're going to have to probably read them from a JSON file or some other way of doing this. I tried that. It's not particularly hard to do, but you have to consider this when you're setting up your game. Can the credentials be hard-coded, or am I going to need to get them from somewhere else and then figure out how to do that? The next thing I did in GBLxAPI, remember that I'm going to send a level completed for each level, and I have 2 levels, and then I'm going to send a satisfied statement for the overall game once both levels are complete. That means that I've got 3 statements, and therefore I'm going to need the agent for those statements 3 times. In addition to that, I'm going to need to know the game ID as an activity 3 times. So in the statements where you're saying level is completed, I'm going to set the context activity parent to the main game so that I can track each level back to the game it belongs to. And in the agent, I'm going to again use it 3 times, and this is kind of a good example of simple GBLxAPI code. This uses something that's called a builder pattern in programming. I actually was not very familiar with it because we don't have any code that works this way in our outfit, but I like it. So you can see there, it's pretty easy to read. I'm creating a GBLxAPI agent or an xAPI agent. I want to use a particular mailbox, so I put .with mailbox, and I say what mailbox to use. And I say what name to put in the agent as its name, and then I say build, and it builds an xAPI object for me that gets used in statements, which is really handy. The other thing you'll notice here is it's the name or the mailbox are both set as something called name transfer dot. So I have a logon screen to my game so I can find out who the user is. I ask them for their name and for their email address in order to be able to send statements with that information. And I store it in something that's static, which means it's basically a global variable for the game, and it won't change while the game is running unless I, in the program, change it to the next player. So that's a nice handy thing for keeping track of who your player is without having to hard code it into every program. Similar for the main game activity, this is the identifier for the game itself as an activity. I'm creating an activity, and you just reference the GBL activity object. You give it a particular ID, you give it a definition, and the with type references the vocabulary for GBLxAPI. I say serious game, and it will automatically give me the IRI for a unit game as an activity type. I give it the name, and I say build, and then that builds the definition, and then build again, and that builds the entire activity. So that's an introduction to the concept of builders in xAPI, and you can see they're fairly easy to read without really having to know a whole lot about xAPI or the code that's going on behind it. In the start event, once the game starts, actually on each level in the start method, which is a method that runs every time a page starts in Unity, I have to init or initialize the GBLxAPI engine. So you call the init method and you pass in the config that in an earlier slide we set and hard-coded, the user ID and password. And the other thing I wanted to do here is initialize a timer. GBL has several different timers that can use. I think the last time I looked, they had 9 different timers that you can use. and you can initialize them with any point, and then you can reference them later, and it will automatically tell you how much time has elapsed since that slot was reset. That's really convenient because trying to build a timer by yourself in Unity is not so easy, and I ended up having to look up the code on the internet to figure out how to make one. They just don't really have a timer object. Since I always want to track duration in xAPI, I had to build one, and it was much more difficult in the other two libraries than it was in GBLxAPI, where I could just say, hey, give me a timer and reset it. The update event in Unity fires every time that a page that you're on is updated, or a scene, they call it. So in the update method, I get the value of the timer in that code that's highlighted because I want to display it on the screen. My game in the upper right-hand corner displays the elapsed time, which if you're playing the game can tend to make you nervous if you're trying to beat somebody else's time. So that's always fun. I get the time and I convert it into something that I can display on the screen because it gives me a float value, and I want to convert it to minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. So I created a method in Unity that would do that for me, and I just call it, and then I display it on the screen. When the level is finished, I want to send a statement. So I call the GBLxAPI statement object, and I pass my actor. Now, you may remember earlier, a couple of slides back, we created the player as agent property as something that's static, and it is always available for sending, so I don't have to recreate it 3 times. I'm going to use the verb completed, and because I overrode the completed verb with my own IRI, that will grab the correct IRI that I wanted. So I don't have to identify all the information about the verb as you normally would. I just say with verb completed, and it will go look it up in that list and bring me back the correct value. Now I want to create a target activity, so this is the object in an xAPI statement. So I want an activity. I give it a particular IRI, which includes the level of the game. So I've got level 1, level 2, and they each have different IRIs. And I give it a type of level, which is another verb value that's defined in the GBLxAPI library. I was able to use what was already there. So it has an activity type of level. And I give it the definition of the activity, which I actually created earlier in the code, but I'm not showing here just for the instance of clarity, or the idea to include better clarity. And I build it, and that becomes my target activity, or my target object. I also want to give a result object because I want to record the duration. How long did it take you to complete level 1? So I say with duration, and I pass the value that I got from the timer in the total number of seconds. And it will convert that float value to the proper format for the xAPI statement, which is somewhat difficult to do if you try to do manually. And GBLxAPI just handles it for you. I also set the complete property because they've completed the level. So I say .complete, and then it sets complete equal true in the JSON automatically for me. And I say build, and it creates that result JSON for me. Then I give it a context because I want to add the parent of the level as add the game itself as the parent of the level that I'm currently on. So the parent is the main activity. I say build to give me my context activities object. And then, and this is interesting, I say in queue, and I give it what's called a callback handler. So GBLxAPI, if you're offline, will actually hold your statements until you are back online, as long as you don't shut down your activity. So if you're running a game and you're playing it offline and you want the statements to come the next time you're back in connected to the network, it will do that for you, and it's automatic and out of the box. Now the callback handler is pretty simple for me. All I wanted to say, it will call this whenever it finishes sending the statements. So if it sent the statement, the result will be true. And I say if the result is true, increment the number of total statements sent, which I initialized earlier to 0. So now I've got 1 statement going because the level was completed. And I actually display on the screen that the number of statements that have been sent so far while playing the game, just so I could kind of debug it. If it fails, it will drop through to here and it will put a log entry on that it failed, and I can read the result text to figure out why it failed. So after the person has finished the 2 levels, I want to send a satisfied statement. Now, this is very similar to sending a level complete, except for a couple of things. First off, the game object itself is the object or the target activity in this statement, whereas before it was the level. But now I'm at the game level itself, so I'm going to go ahead and use the game itself as the object of the statement. In addition, because we're now at the game level, we don't need to send a parent activity. So I don't go ahead and set the parent context activity as I did in the send statement method that we looked at earlier. So that's the only difference. So now at this point, I've sent 3 statements and the game is complete. And when you click a button, you will go to the leaderboard. So let's talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of using GBLxAPI. First of all, it's super easy to set up and use compared to the other 2 libraries, which I actually got the GBLxAPI game running in probably 20 minutes. Now, I was experienced at using this game and the Unity code, so take that with a grain of salt, but it was certainly faster than working with the other products. I love that statements are queued, and I did test this out by disconnecting my computer from the network, playing the game, and then hooking it back up, and within a couple of minutes, the statements all were sent to the LRS. So that's a really cool feature that I didn't have to write myself. The library had a major overhaul in 21, and that was the creation of all these builder objects. Before it had that, I looked at GBLxAPI and I thought it was really complicated, so I had decided not to use it. When they rewrote it, it became so much easier to use that I sort of switched over to a big fan from being somebody who didn't think it was usable. With the builders, the code is super readable. You don't have to be a programmer to sort of understand what's going on in the creation of statements. It's very English-like. The cons. The Excel files, there are Excel files that you can use to make the vocabulary instead of directly editing the JSON like I did earlier. I never could get it to work. And when I contacted the folks at GBLxAPI, the person I talked to said they couldn't get it to work either. So I don't know if that's been fixed since then, but for me, and probably for you guys who are working with the xAPI now and are familiar with how JSON works, it would probably be easier to just exit or edit the JSON files themselves directly rather than going through a 3-step process of editing the files, running the program, and then examining the vocabulary afterwards to make sure it worked. So that wasn't a really big con to me. It's a broken feature in the system they should either remove or fix. A couple of other cons. The library only addresses the writing of statements. So I needed to have a leaderboard. That means I need to fetch statements back so that I can have the leaderboard run over time, even when the game is not running and a new person comes in, they can see the leaderboard. So that was an issue. There is also an issue with newer versions of Unity. I developed originally in version 19.x, and when 20.x8 came out, it broke my game. This is kind of common with Unity. If you're having experience with Unity, if you upgrade versions, you will probably break something, because almost always between major versions, they change stuff and take stuff out, and things tend to break. On the good news side, there's a solution to both of these items, and we'll look at that next. So as I mentioned, I wanted to have a leaderboard, and my leaderboard displays the top 20 scores. But because somebody can play the game multiple times, you've got to do some filtering so that you only get the best score for each person to go into the leaderboard. So if I play it 10 times, I still may end up the #1 person on the leaderboard, but I could also have the worst score. I guess I could do a reverse leaderboard too. That'd be fun. So I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this GBLxAPI. I couldn't really figure it out. So I thought maybe I could use both GBLxAPI and the one I'm really familiar with, tincan.net, in the same code? And would I be able to get them to work together? So in my exploration around this, as I was trying to add the tincan.net library to my existing Unity project, I was browsing around in the GBLxAPI folder, and I found out that GBLxAPI is actually a wrapper for tincan.net. It takes care of some of the integration problems that I mentioned I had with tincan.net out of the box, and it just wraps up the tincan statements and objects in an easy to use builder or wrapper that's much easier to use than tincan.net itself if you're not just really familiar with C#. So now I realized I could write tincan.net code right into my Unity project, and it would work perfectly right alongside the GBLxAPI library. I would just kind of have to write at a bit lower level than the GBLxAPI library, which does a lot of the work for you and hides all the complexity. So in tincan.net, there's the way to build a query for the LRS itself. So this is my building of a query. I'm calling a tincan.net object called statements query, and I'm setting some properties. I set a start date, which is the sense part of an xAPI query. I want the data in ascending order. I'm limiting it to 1,000 statements. The format is the exact format, which I'm quite honestly not all that familiar with the different formats. And I gave the verb ID. So I want the verb to be the satisfied verb because I only want the completed games. I don't need all the level information. That doesn't really matter for my leaderboard. And I gave the game URI as the activity I wanted to fetch. So basically, I'm fetching all the statements since a certain date that match my verb, satisfied verb, and the game. And then I have code in the example that you can see that will create a leaderboard for you by going through all those statements and filtering out the top score of each student. And that's all just C# code, so I'm not going to go through it here. So to call the LRS and get that data back, I have to use something LRS.queryStatements. And the LRS I set earlier, there's a different way to set your LRS in the tincan.net library than there is in the GBLxAPI library. It's a little bit more difficult, but not much. So I call its query statements, and I pass that object that I built earlier, and it will return me back the statements that I'm looking for. Now you will notice that I have wrapped this in a try loop because I want to do this. The internet doesn't always work the first time. It's kind of amazing, but it still doesn't. So I generally try things in xAPI 2 or 3 times before I give up on them. So I call the query statements method, and it gives me back in the LRS response the statements that I was looking for. And when it's successful, it breaks out of this loop. And then I've got some code further down below in that same file that say, give me the statements, which is just ask the response.content.statements, and it gives me all my statements. And then I start all of my code trying to figure out who's actually atop the leaderboard, so I get the best scores of everyone that's in my list. I'm going to jump back 1 second. One thing I would caution if you were using this in a sort of production environment with a whole lot of users, this is probably not the fastest way to do this because you're going to want to look at more than 1,000 statements. You might even have 1,000 users of your game or your Unity program. So you probably ought to have something external to this that will query and get all the information you need and give you back a leaderboard like a REST API call or something. And if you want to have good performance, if you try querying thousands and thousands of statements and loop through them inside of your Unity game, you're going to provide a bad experience for your user because it's going to be slow. So as I mentioned originally in the presentation, I got asked this question because it was about VR. They wanted somebody to take a VR training program, have the statement sent to the LRS, and then that LRS would actually call an API for our LMS and give them credit. So they had an audit trail inside the LMS. So now I had to build a VR game. Fortunately, there was a pretty good example that I was able to find on Unity itself in their unity.learn library, or learn.unity, I think. on how to have somebody jump a car using jumper cables. And then once it was started, it would play a loud noise like the car starting. And I wanted to send statements from that. So does this work in VR? The answer is yes, it does. There's really not any difference. All the code for sending statements from GBLxAPI doesn't change at all. So that's great. It works in VR. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever. And this is just an example of that jump a car game where we sent 7 statements. So we send that it's initialized, which is when the game starts or somebody is logged in. We send that they've put the cables on the good battery, on the positive and negative cables, on the dead battery, on the negative first, and then the positive, and then they satisfy the jump a car game. And I also write a terminated statement because I just can't stop doing CMI5 like stuff. So essentially, in summary, we've looked at several libraries for sending xAPI statements from Unity and shown that GBLxAPI with the tincan.net child that's in it is the best option for most cases, especially if you need to retrieve statements back or potentially write to the other APIs than the statement API. And as I mentioned, the same code will work in VR. Here are some references to the tincan.net library. Also, I have a modified version of that library called xAPI.net, which you can use, and I've added some additional stuff to it. Some of the things it didn't do, I've added to it, and that's available free on GitHub. The ADL Unity xAPI wrapper, there's a link to it if you want to try that out instead. But again, I recommend the one under GBLxAPI.org, and that will actually link you to a GitHub site where you can download the code. The game example is on my GitHub site. I believe these slides are going to be available to you all, so you don't need to write down these links. I've sent them over to the guild. Some other links. As I mentioned, the GBLxAPI library does have an issue with one of the JSON libraries that it's using, or the primary JSON library. That's because Unity changed and put their own JSON library in, so the two libraries conflict. So there's a link to where you can find out what the issue is, and I provided a solution in that issue for how you can easily fix it. As I understand it, GBLxAPI has put out a fix for that. I have not personally tested it, so I don't know if it works or not. If it doesn't work, you can just follow my instructions that are in that issue to fix it. And then there's some of the articles I've written on doing this. I've written one on using tincan.net library and one on using GBLxAPI. So there are links there for that if you want to go see them. And that is it for me, and I think I'm right on time.
Yep, you are. Thank you so much for that, Art. And everybody, I will be posting the deck that they sent us, which has all the code examples plus all the different links so that you can try that yourself. So, Art, would you please stop sharing? I'm going to go and reshare because now we've gotten to a point where we're going to be looking and talking to people for our there we go. I'm inviting people to the stage right now who are going to be speaking about their projects. And so I've got Cecilia Fernandez coming and Larissa Marion, and there they both are. So Larissa, when you're ready, go ahead, open your camera up and your mic, and Cecilia will be here momentarily. And they're going to be talking to us about the xAPI beginners. So go ahead, Larissa.
So, hi everyone, I am Larissa, and it is great to be here with you today. And I just wanted to touch base alongside with Cecilia about the xAPI beginner team. We wanted to just encourage everybody to be involved and to participate, to publish courses and to take each other's courses so we can have data in the xAPI beginner team channel. And I also wanted to give you a heads up that we'll be posting when to meet link to schedule our last meetings for the cohort, and then updates as well for the presentation, which will be coming on week 12 on April 18. So it's time to start geared up for that. So we're excited to see your collaboration and participation, and we look forward to working with you.
That is great. And Cecilia, I understand you have an update as well? I don't think we're hearing you. I'm not hearing you. I think it looks like you're talking, but we're not hearing you. I know Cecilia is having some storms where she's at, so she may not be able to connect to us today. Did you, Cecilia, I'll give you a couple more seconds. Nope, I guess not. She just typed in chat. Unfortunately, we can't get her update. Do you know, Larissa, what she was going to speak on, perhaps, or?
So what we wanted to both of us to encourage the team members to get more involved now that we are getting towards the second half or the last leg of the cohort, and to participate. Now we at this time we are sharing each other's courses, and we're going in and taking them and collecting xAPI data, publishing it into LRS. So we're excited to see your work, and we want to see the participation in the Slack channel. I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks so much, Larissa and Cecilia. We very much appreciate that. I'm just going to hide you from the stage, and you're so we have you there, and they were telling us, obviously, the beginner cohort. It has been a fan favorite or a cohort favorite for the people just beginning in xAPI. So that is that group. The next group that I have an update for, I've got some updates. You're going to hear them from me. Unfortunately, the people who are in these teams could not be here for this day or whatever. So Learning Dojo with Jeff Batt, that's one of our program partners. So they're doing a video and a script and sending xAPI statements. So as you can see, this is the team's update. Is that they've taken that script, they've broken it down, and now they're going to plan out those xAPI statements that will be sent when the video is viewed. So right there, that's a great project. And by the way, if you are just joining xAPI cohort for the first time, no worries. Join one of these teams. Go into the Slack channel, go to the channels, browse, and then browse by first or most recent, I think it is, and you will see some of the newer channels here for this cohort. Now, this one, we had an update from Bill last week, and he went through some information. He went to a couple of the other teams and went, I've got to restart the project. Perfect. It's week 7. No worries. Get the project restarted. So you can go and look at his team name and see what they're planning on doing. He has a great deal of documentation he's laid out to restart the project, and he has a couple of people who are joining him. Our another program partner is with Torrance Learning. And as you can see what they're doing, obviously test your LMS. And they have added this week to add some of the adapters of xAPI that are listed on xapi.com. Some of the LMSs there, they're going to add them to their list. And the plan is to hopefully getting an article to share about their results of this project. So that's kind of exciting stuff. And this one is using RISE and xAPI. And that has become to be quite the challenge, as it is in the title name. And so there were some questions that they tried looking for answers for. And so they actually sent an email to the Articulate Success team and asked those questions. So they're waiting to hear back so that they can move forward with their project. And then, of course, there is this project about the project creating minimalist code, and it's about the same. And if you'd like to join it, please do. It is currently being manned by just a few people, so you can certainly join and find that out. Another program partner is with Build Capable, and it's a DIY xAPI project. Basically, you go into the channel, Team Spring 2024 with Build Capable, and at the very, very top is basically the instructions for you to go through a DIY project. So, and just as a reiteration, and it's been noted many, many times, you're asked for your name and email address. They're not going to do anything with it. It's just so those statements get sent. And then KPI Measurement, Spring 2024, another program partner. That's with a conglomeration of folks who are experts in the xAPI space. And so they're looking at KPIs and reporting goals. And so that's still going on. And if you are interested in that kind of work, please check out their channel. And then lastly, your project here. So even though it's week 7, if this is your first week into xAPI cohort and you're like, hey, I've got a project, you need to create a team channel with hashtag team at the beginning, and then post your description and your team channel name in hashtag main so that you can get other folks to join you. That's it for us here. We are going to have some project demos, demonstrations. We're calling it a project showcase. That'll be occurring, and we'll let you know more about that next week, not tomorrow, but next week. So everyone, thanks so much for joining us here at the xAPI cohort. We look forward to seeing you for week 8. There are only a few more weeks left. And everyone, have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.